us feel like this holiday season has been moving incredibly fast. Wow. I was walking my dog, passing by my neighbor's house the other day, and I could see in their living room through the window. I'm not a creep, I promise. They have big windows, okay? So I could see through their window, and I saw their Christmas tree up, and my first thought was, gosh, they still have their tree up? And then I realized, oh, Christmas hasn't even happened yet. Okay. But just as this season has been moving right along, so have we been moving right along through this series that we've been in called December Lights. Maybe this is your first time joining us as part of this series, and we've been looking at how the symbol of light shows up in various spiritual traditions, spiritual holidays, things that are celebrated at this time of year. And through the past couple of weeks, we've looked at things that maybe we don't have as much familiarity with. And moving forward, and particularly today, we're going to look at Christmas, but look at a story that maybe we have some familiarity with, but we don't know the full story, or we're not totally familiar with the background and the context. And so what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at an aspect of the Nativity, and I've added some nativity. We have this is getting really busy, so I hope by next week we're going to be overflowing with room. But I've added the wise men, and as Kathleen said, that's what we're going to be talking about today. But, when it comes to the nativity and why it is the way it is, how it's arranged, we might not be totally sure about what this has to do with the Christmas story. So we're going to explore a little bit of that more today. But in general, maybe you're someone where when it comes to the nativity, your biggest question is just like, why? And so if that's you, I just wanted to go through a couple of more of examples of the nativity that might just make you go, why? Okay, so first I have the hipster nativity. Okay. So the wise men are Amazon delivery drivers on Segways. And then, of course, at the center, you have apparently Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, who are a little preoccupied with the selfie. We have an 80s nativity, which I think is great because you have, I think, Bill and Ted as the shepherds. You have a trio of Darth Vaders as the wise men, and Batman as the angel, which I think checks out. I've included this just because, it's Aldea. We know how we feel about dogs here, so. And then lastly, if you're hungry today, this one might particularly appeal to you, but this is kind of a nativity hash, if you will. So, and then sometimes even a more traditional nativity might have something a little off about it. Take a look at this.
So we're in Hobby Lobby trying to find some kind of little nativity scene. We found this one, it's cute. But you see what they did? They went smart with it. They didn't put on faces, unlike this one. Okay, first of all, Joseph, dude, you should have slept the night before. Alright. Or whatever the heck you are. Mary is, oh my gosh. I mean, it's still though, Jesus. I didn't even see Mary's face till just. That's not the only one. They did more like that. I have a feeling these ones are definitely going to be here for a while.
So apparently those might still be available if you want to head over to your nearest Hobby Lobby. But I just want to give a little disclaimer as we get into today's message. Maybe as we talk about the nativity, as we talk about some themes around Christmas, maybe this isn't your story. Maybe this isn't your tradition or something you grew up with. Or maybe you did grow up with it and you've kind of moved away from the Christian narrative a bit. Regardless, what I hope that you understand today is that this doesn't have to be your story for us to find inspiration and wisdom from it as a story. Because anytime we approach story, period, it can be a launching point for a productive and fruitful conversation about living a spiritual life and exploring some universal themes. And so we're going to be looking at the wise men today, and yet I think that much of the story that we have in our heads is different than what's actually written down, that maybe we remember it a little differently, probably because the way we talk about it is actually different from how it's originally captured in the story. And this includes a number of things. It includes the number of wise men. There is actually not a number given, as we're going to explore. Second, the identity is a bit different than we think. First of all, there's nothing that even saying that they're men, and we often talk about them like, oh, the three kings, nothing about them being kings. So we're going to explore a little bit about who they were, because it's actually quite fascinating. And lastly, the timing, I think, is very interesting, because they're generally included in the nativity scene, which is a model of the birth of Jesus. And yet, as we're going to see in the story, there is no reason to believe that they were there directly at the birth of Jesus. So it's one of those things where we kind of misremember it in certain ways because of how we've talked about it since. And it's interesting because this idea of misremembering certain things and feeling certain that, oh man, I thought that was the case and it's not, is something that shows up in our culture all the time, particularly, I think, with some very well-known movie quotes. Because there are some movie quotes where we hear them repeated and then they've changed since. So I'll give you an example. How many of you think you know the famous line from this scene in the second Star Wars movie, The Empire Strikes Back? What is it? Luke, I am your father. We are all wrong. The line is not Luke, I am your father. It's no, I am your father, right? So something we misremembered, we misheard. How about this? Field of Dreams. What's the famous line from Field of Dreams? They will come, right? Except it's if you build it, he will come, because it's in reference to the main character's father, something we misremember. How about this? Mama always said... Now, it's slightly different, but it's Mom always said life was like a box of chocolate, so was, okay? And then lastly, how about this? Perhaps the most famous. What do you think the line is here? E.T. phone home, except it's not. Sorry to ruin your childhood. It's E.T. home phone. So we don't necessarily have the full picture on so many things, because over time, through our conversations, through bringing things up, we actually lose some of that original meaning. And my hope is that today, as we return to this story of the wise men, returning to it will be potent for us, that it'll provide some inspiration, provide some new perspectives. And so I want to start with this story, which picks up in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And I'm going to kind of go through it and just pause a little bit as we notice some things. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem village, a band of scholars, the word actually is Magi or seers, arrived in Jerusalem from the east. Now, what we see here already answers those three kind of question marks for us. First of all, we notice the number and the gender is never mentioned, right? Second, their identity. They are not kings, they are magi. And we're going to explain a little bit about what that means. And lastly, the timing. It just says after Jesus was born. So we have no indication that they were there on the night of Jesus' birth. It could have been weeks, months, or even years. So they arrive in Jerusalem, and they ask around, where can we find and pay homage to the newborn King of the Jews? We observed a star in the eastern sky that signaled his birth. We are on pilgrimage to worship him. When word of their inquiry got to Herod, he was terrified. Now, Herod is the king of the Jews at this point. Though they are under subjugation of the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire would install kings that they felt could essentially do their bidding for them. And so Herod is terrified because he is threatened by the idea of a king that would replace him. And so what I want you to realize is that in this story, Herod is the representation of that which tries to snuff out and prevent new life, new light from entering into the world. And so he arranges a secret meeting with the scholars from the East, pretending to be as devout as they were. He got them to tell him exactly when the birth announcement star appeared. Now, this is a story from 2,000 years ago, so I understand that maybe there's some things that we can't fully relate to. So I'm sure that we in no way could relate to the idea of someone in power or authority pretending to be religiously devout in order to gain something. But I'll move on. He said, "Go find this child, leave no stone unturned. As soon as you find him, send word and I'll join you at once in your worship." Instructed by the king, they set off. Then the star appeared again, the same star they had seen in the eastern skies. It led them on until it hovered over the place of the child. They could hardly contain themselves. They were in the right place. They had arrived at the right time. They entered the house and saw the child in the arms of Mary, his mother. Overcome, they kneeled and worshipped him. They opened their luggage and presented gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. In a dream, they were warned not to report back to Herod, so they worked out another route, left the territory without being seen, and returned to their own country. Today, our December light is going to be a star in the eastern sky, a celestial, a cosmic light. See, over the past few weeks, we talked about some lights that we directly participate in, the lights of Hanukkah and Kwanzaa that we might light to remember our dedication to our spiritual path, the light of the Yule log, which is warmth and light in that darkest, coldest season of life. But today's light is a little bit more mystical. It's a little bit more far off. It's not something that we light ourselves, but something that we observe and we follow. How many of us find meaning when we look up at the stars? It perhaps reminds you of our smallness, our place in the universe. Recently, I had the opportunity, Olivia and I had the opportunity to visit Sedona, and I always find that Sedona is a place where you can see the stars really well, and I was just blown away. You know, sometimes you don't really get to see them in their full beauty for a while, and then you do, and it just reminds you of your place in the universe. And I could have sworn that I saw the Big Dipper, and Olivia said, "That's not the Big Dipper. Everything could be the Big Dipper. You're saying that's a Big Dipper, but you have no idea." And so it's an argument. As we got home, I still think I can see it, and she thinks I can't. And so we're just going to have to work that out on our own. But sometimes you look up at the night sky, and we just see an incredible beauty that moves us. Right? Or perhaps you're someone who's into astrology, and when you look at the stars or you read the patterns of the stars, you find meaning, symbolism, and guidance. What's interesting is you would actually be in company with the Magi. Craig S. Keener, who writes a commentary on this story, says that the Magi were astrologers, likely from Babylon or Persia, where astrology was a developed science. Their interpretation of the star as heralding a Jewish king fits with the popular association of celestial events with royal births. So we don't know a lot about these characters from the story, but we know that they are called Magi, and we know who the Magi were. And this is who the Magi were. And so when we think about this story, and we think about these people who observed this star, maybe we get some clarity that it's not just some armchair astrologers going, "Oh, I think I see something, I'm going to go follow it." These were experts, very respected in their field. You know, perhaps the star, which is so often portrayed as being this big, obvious star, perhaps it was a lot smaller and they only saw it because they were trained to. But something I think that's important to understand as we talk about the Magi is that all throughout human spirituality, throughout diverse spiritual traditions from all across the world and across diverse time periods, there have always been those who show up, such as the mystics and the shamans and people like the Magi, who observe things in the natural world and find meaning and patterns and associations and guidance. And so we don't know exactly who the Magi were, what bound them together. Maybe they didn't even know each other before this journey, but what we do know is that they were united by the fact that they found meaning in this sign that they observe in the night sky. And this light compels them on a journey. And when we think about that journey, what I want to encourage us toward today is really these 3 points of what they do in response to being pulled on this journey, and how we might draw inspiration from this when the stars show up in our own lives. And the first thing they do when they see this light in the sky is they follow it. They follow it. And I wonder, in your life, have you ever followed a light like this? Have you ever encountered a sign or an inner nudging, something within your soul that pulled you forward, that invited you on a journey, and you followed it? Perhaps it was a relationship, a change or advancement in your career, some new development of your spiritual path. What these things have in common generally is that they rely on our intuition, that there is something within us calling us forward. As Deepak Chopra says, they are like the whispers of your soul. Listen to the whispers of your soul. Trust them as you would trust the map of a navigator. So perhaps these whispers of the soul, they act for us like north stars, providing this internal guidance. That when we face moments in our lives, we are unsure of what to do, unsure of what direction to take, this guidance shows up and says, hey, follow this. And something I feel so honored about as being here at Aldea is getting to hear the stories of people week after week who are on this journey in their life, or maybe they went through long periods of their life, not sure exactly where to go, not sure what to do, and then all of a sudden something like a star appears. Some new aspect of their spiritual path opens up. Something comes into their life like a sign, and they follow it like they never have before. And I relate so much to these stories because this is my story, that when I first began to explore spirituality outside of the tradition that I was brought up in, it went from being something that, I was a little curious about to something that I felt compelled towards. It went from a want to a have to, but not an obligatory have to, but a beckoning of my soul. Those of you who might consider yourself creative or artists out there, you might know this voice as the muse, that which compels you and inspires you to create something. And it both feels that it comes from within you and it comes from without. And friends, there's something to be said about structuring our lives in such a way that when these lights appear, that we can move on them, that we can follow them. Something we have to imagine about the Magi is that if they are in their hometowns respected scholars of this type of mystical wisdom, that they probably had jobs and they had a livelihood being a part of these systems. And yet what they do is when they see this light, they pretty much drop everything and follow it. And in some ways, we have to understand that this is part of who they were. This is part of what they had been prepared to do their whole lives. They had structured their lives in such a way that when something big shows up, they were ready to follow it. And I think this is what artists often feel, right? That artists recognize when they are being called to create something, but it is important that they don't just wait for that call, but they are also working on their craft and practicing their abilities, because you might have experienced this before. I know I have. You feel a sense of inspiration, and yet you don't even know how to follow it, how to move on it, how to create. And so it's important to, like the Magi, structure your life in such a way where you are able to work with that inspiration. I think of the same thing for our spiritual lives. We wait for insight, we wait for clarity, and yet it's also important to be doing our spiritual work so that when it shows up, we can integrate it. We know what path to take. So sometimes these paths show up as north stars, but sometimes they show up as south stars, as author and podcaster Rob Bell talks about. That these aren't, sometimes these stars that appear in our lives aren't necessarily things that we follow, but things that we need to get as far away from. See, how many of us in life, in certain aspects of our life, we learned what to do by learning what not to do, by seeing someone's example of what not to do. See, sometimes people give us this gift, as hard as it is. The best example that they can provide for us is showing us who we don't want to be, right? We've all had that as well. So whether that guidance comes from a North Star or a South Star, we've all probably experienced some version of this. And so that first thing that we should be thinking about is to follow it when it shows up. But here's the second part. When we follow it, when we go on this journey, we are going to be asked to cross some borders, to find ourselves in some unfamiliar territory. See, when you follow like the Magi did, you are going to be taken to unfamiliar lands, right? Perhaps interfacing with other cultures, which is why one thing I love about this story is that there is really a strong interfaith component to this story of the Magi. Matthew Fox, the theologian and author, says that the Magi teach us that truth and wisdom are not confined to one tradition. Their journey celebrates the sacredness of seeking and the holiness of encounters across boundaries. It is a story of trust in the mystery that transcends cultural and religious differences. Sometimes following the light requires us to step outside of the known. Maybe this is a literal stepping out or a metaphorical stepping out. But nonetheless, we are going to be required to go into places that are not currently on our map. Emerson says, "Do not go where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail." Rumi resonates this as he says, as you start to walk on the way appears. Maybe for you, it was a literal stepping out. You left a community and you sought something new. Perhaps that's why you're here today, or perhaps you moved, right? I experienced this when Aldea came into my life. I had this realization that it was time for me to cross some borders, cross some boundaries, and leave the frigid Northwest for the spicy Southwest in more ways than one. You know, and I have friends here today who are visiting from Washington, but who were walking with me at that point in the journey of life where I said, I think I need to travel into an unfamiliar land in order to follow this star in my life. So sometimes it is literal, right? But then sometimes it shows up as metaphor. That sometimes to step out means to do it just in the confines of our own hearts and minds. Sometimes we step out by entertaining some new ideas, right? Or maybe letting go of some identities, some ways that we pictured ourselves, saw ourselves, and being open to new concepts. Maybe it means being brave in some relationships. Maybe it means connecting to spirituality outside of the religion that you are most comfortable in. Maybe it means recognizing, like the Magi did, the universality of spirituality. And so what do? We follow and we step out into unfamiliar territory. And the third thing is, when we get there and when we feel lost or unsure of what our next step is, remember to keep trusting that the star will appear again. See, there is this moment in the story where the Magi arrive in Jerusalem. And though it isn't explicitly said, it's a bit of subtext. We see that the star appears again, which can only mean for us that there was a moment where they arrive and they are unsure of where to go, and the star has yet to appear again, and they are wandering and they are lost and they are trying to figure out what now. And as far as I understand, Google was not yet a thing and the internet was not yet a part of this story. To my understanding, it shows up a little bit later in the story. And so they had no way of navigating past where they had been brought. And yet what happens? In the story, it says that the star appears again, telling them that they were in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Sometimes, friends, we go on this journey and we get in the ballpark of where we think we have been led to, and then things go dark, right? Maybe you're in your journey right now and you've followed some of these stars, some of these nudgings, you've taken some risks. You started that business or you stepped out in a new way on your spiritual path, or maybe you're just entering into a new chapter of life and you're saying, now what? And what I love about the encouragement we get in this story is that the story returns its focus back to the star, back to the why that ignited this whole thing in the first place. Friends, when you feel lost, bring yourself back to that star. Why did you begin this journey in the first place? And let it reignite for you. See, friends, I was brought to this community following a star, and yet there are still moments and there are still days where I am not sure of what path to take, of which way is north and which way is south. And I'm so grateful that I have all of you and I have the leadership team as North Stars for me. But sometimes I also need to return to that very star that brought me here in the first place. This inner call and this inner drive to be a part of a community that was intentional about growing spiritually, about belonging, about growing in love, about love, period, extending that to all, and creating a place where we can show up as our full self. And sometimes, when I don't know which way to turn, I remember that star, and that is all I need to help carry me forward. And this, friends, I think is an example of the type of faith that I think we can have. Not necessarily having all the answers, but a return to that original unmanifested yet very real desire and calling in our heart. Or as Indian sage Sri Aurobindo says, faith is the soul's witness to something not yet manifested but felt as real, a hidden reality awaiting birth. What is that for you today? And yet what happens? What happens? We get caught up. Right? We get caught up in the details sometimes, right? Like how this new journey I'm going to take in my life, how is this going to work financially? Or what if the people in my life don't support me? What if they don't like what I'm doing? Or what about the disruptions that this change is going to cause, right? We get in our head. And then sometimes that's all just internal, but sometimes things show up externally as roadblocks. Sometimes the King Herods show up and things get even messier, right? People or systems stand in the way of what we're trying to do. Things get co-opted, and whether it is internal or external, friends, we end up lost looking once again for that star. But what I love about this story is that the star shows up once again when it is needed the most. But if and when we have eyes to see it, when we are open, when we are looking to the sky. See, the Magi wouldn't have seen the star reappear if they weren't looking to the sky, where they knew to look, right? And you cannot look to the sky if you are not lifting up your head, right? If you are not willing to take a bigger perspective and step a little bit outside of the things right in front of you. And what I love about how the Magi show up in this story, and I think it's very important to remember, is that they were experts, right? They weren't just some delusional people following this star. They were experts, and they had been tracking these things perhaps their whole lives. And so when the star appears again, they are ready. They have been watching, they have been waiting. And friends, they do not doubt themselves in this moment, like I doubt myself seeing the Big Dipper. Friends, when you are lost, when you are waiting for that direction, don't forget to look to the sky. Don't forget to keep your head up. Don't forget to trust that the star will appear again. And don't forget to trust your own experience, because you know it's appeared again in the past. And if you're wondering, well, what does that look like practically? I would just ask a couple of questions. Are you listening to that voice within? Are you meditating? Are you creating space in your life to listen, to hear? And are you looking for how bad things are, right? Or are you looking to the sky, looking at how good things could be? See, friends, what I love about approaching this story from the context of a greater metaphor and archetypes of how we might actually look at ourselves in the story, we get to really place ourselves at any point in the story and find some new meaning. So perhaps in this story, we are the Magi. Perhaps you feel like you relate to the Magi as someone who who is recognizing something new coming into the world, right? And you want to follow it and you want to pay homage to it. Maybe you're Mary in this story. You are the very person and the very thing through which new life is coming into the world. Perhaps you're Jesus in this story. You yourself are bringing new life into a situation, into someone else's circumstance. Maybe you're Joseph and your fiance just told you that she's pregnant, but don't worry, it's God's baby. Maybe you've been there. Or maybe honestly, maybe at times, without even realizing it, we've been King Herod, right? And without realizing it, we've tried to stamp out something new emerging in the world. But whoever you find yourself to be in this story, maybe remember to pay attention, to be on the lookout, right? For not only that star to reappear, but who are we being right now in this story? May we be curious about that and not so judgmental. So friends, what is that star in your eastern sky right now? Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's an idea or a dream that is tugging on your heart. Maybe it's a path that you know you need to take. Maybe it's a spiritual practice that you're ready to commit to, or maybe it's simply a new chapter unfolding in your life. But as we take some inspiration from the Magi, maybe remember to follow that star. Maybe remember that in following, we're going to be asked to journey into some unfamiliar places. And when we feel lost and unsure of what the next step is, maybe remember to look up and keep our eyes on the sky for that star to reappear. Aldea, may your December light send you on a journey that you are courageous enough to follow. And when it takes you across borders, when it takes you into unfamiliar places, may you remember that you are in good company, that you are not alone. And when, as we so often do, when we lose our way, when we forget the path, may we remember to lift up our heads, because we might find ourselves in exactly the right place at exactly the right time.